Hello, good morning, and welcome back to the Tech23 Impact Circles. And for those new to the circles, a brand new welcome to you. Now, thank you all for joining today's conversation, which is sure to be a mind-stretching one. It's about something that's impacting the agri-food supply chain, lowering the intensity of agriculture. As is custom, I would first like to acknowledge both the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where the Slatterys team works, meets, and creates. We pay our respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. We're also aware that others are joining from elsewhere today, so please do say hi in the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Today's conversation will be led by Sarah Nolet, and she's joined by Dr. Natalie Hummel and Nancy Schellhorn. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd first and very last would just like to make a special shout out to the Tech23 sponsors, Transport for New South Wales, Main Sequence Cyro Innovation Fund, Oz Industry Entrepreneurs Program delivered in partnership with I4 Connect, Addison's, ASX, AMSTO, Curtin University, Cicada Innovations, and Evoke AG for making Tech23 happen. It's good to see you here, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Adina, and hello, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome everyone and to thank our contributors, a couple of whom are dialing in today from the US. So thank you for staying awake and taking part. We are very excited at Tech23 to shine a light on Australian innovators, and especially those that are chipping away at some of the greatest challenges we face. So we are looking forward to meeting in the flesh, perhaps, fingers crossed, in December. And we just want to thank all of those people that have been contributing to these circles, and thank you all for Zooming in today. Please say hello, as Adina suggested, and introduce yourselves in the chat and ask any questions. We also will have the link to our charter, which gives you an idea of the behaviour that we expect and encourage at all of our events. Just a reminder that there are lots of Tech23 circles past that you can have a look at on the Tech23 website. And just a reminder that today we are recording. I am so looking forward to this conversation, and I'm delighted and honoured to introduce and pass over to Sarah. Hello, Sarah.
Awesome. Hey, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me. And Nancy and Natalie, thanks so much for joining across 3 time zones, and I'm sure many more with the folks listening. And invite everyone to jump in with questions anytime. Please put them in the chat so we can include you in the discussion. I thought I might start with kind of where my head went when Rachel asked if we could have a discussion. And in thinking about agriculture and some of the conversations we've been having in the investment world and globally, you know, here in California and in Australia, there seems to be this shift towards thinking about, I guess, sustainability and lower intensity production, whether that's emissions or chemicals or resource usage. And I'm sort of torn on whether this is like I'm drinking the Kool-Aid and I'm inside this tent where I believe this needs to happen and no one else really does, or is this really a big shift that's starting to take place in a different way than maybe it has in the past? I don't know, Natalie, what are you seeing? Is it a different conversation today than it has been?
I think it is. I think it is a more substantial and meaningful conversation happening right now. And I have to admit that maybe being home during the pandemic, it gave us more time to pause and reflect. And many people did get back to growing their own food items and realizing what went into having a garden, for instance, but also experiencing the drastic weather changes that are happening around the world. I think as humans, we are starting to experience these things, and it is becoming, personally, I, for instance, joined UPL in the role that I'm in now because I felt really committed to the cause that I believe the leadership is committed to really drive some sustainable solutions and not just have lip service. I do feel like it's becoming a bit different. Still has all the same challenges associated with making it happen in terms of trying to do these things and still be profitable and all the challenges that farmers have going into their operation. But it does feel like there's a little bit of a different element to it lately, in my opinion.
So do you think that people are listening now because of the pause, because of the opportunity we've bumped up against the environment a bit more? In other words, if we hadn't had the global pandemic, would the timing still be good?
I think it's such a good question, and like
question.
how much reflection are we doing, and also like how if that's true, then how much will it stick? Like, is this just going to go away? And we've got this interesting like reflection point, but also we've got houses full of takeaway containers, and we can't bring keep cups to get coffee, and we sort of have this excuse to not be so sustainable right now as well. So it's an interesting moment. I would say some of the things that give me hope are the some of the macro pictures around the IPCC report, around the Task Force for Climate Disclosure. It's not only now that consumers are demanding sustainable options, which you can argue is niche or not, but there might not be lending if you're not disclosing climate risk, or there might not be access to capital or things if you're not reporting. So to me, that seems like a thing that's pretty new and that might move the needle, hopefully.
Absolutely. I think, Natalie, what, your insight on that is fantastic. And if I think about when I started my graduate work as a master's student, back in the very late 80s, it was for agroecology and sustainable pest management, and really trying to, look at this problem with the way that insects compete with humans for food and the often very environmentally unacceptable ways that we had to control them. And so the conversation for sustainability has been continuing, and different terminology and the lexicon changes a bit. But it does seem like we keep nudging the conversation, and we nudge the practices, and we look for the ways to break down the barriers. So I do think it's a fascinating time right now, and the opportunity. Several things have come together to make sustainability and lowering the intensity a more meaningful conversation, a more meaningful opportunity for action.
Yeah, I do hope that's true. Ironically, a friend of mine just joined Chico actually in an agroecology role. So she's also passionate about that topic. But one thing I think that was interesting, and it did catch me off guard, seeing the disruptions in the supply chain that happened because of the pandemic and the way food moved, and the fact that, well, it kind of put a spotlight on how much food waste there maybe is, in the way that all of a sudden we were all eating the same amount of food, you would argue, but there was a lot of food going to waste just because of all different types of disruptions. But it made me really think a bit more about that. And I think it did cause a lot of people to think about where their food comes from and how it's grown, and maybe put more of a spotlight on what they believe should be done to grow their food, depending on what their values are, what their education or background might be, what they know about the regulations around pesticide registrations and things like that. I think it did cause that. And it does seem to, with technology coming for track and trace, I see more and more on packages that I'm buying that says, you can, I think there was a bag of potato chips we picked up the other day. Oh, shouldn't be eaten. The pandemic. But bag of potato chips, it really was, it had a little thing, read about the farmer here. I don't know if it traced to the farm, like theoretically it could, or one of the farms they were spotlighting, but there's more of that that's really showing up on kind of more mainstream consumer packaging. And so I think people are really getting more interested. And then, of course, the interest would be to try to do this the best we can. So I think that's a natural inclination as well.
Another driver, I believe that consumers want that. I'm skeptical that it will move the needle enough that companies will actually change practices, whether that's, someone's incentive to sell more of a current product, or kind of where they sit in the system. And unfortunately, another driver, at least in California, where I've been for the last couple months, has been regulations. The cost of regulations, I saw a study the other day in lettuce in California, cost of regulations has gone up 700+%, whereas cost of production alone has gone up just over 100%. So it's 7x just in regulatory costs. And much of that is around environmental compliance, water, health and safety. So there's serious pressures on growers to think about intensity of production from a cost basis perspective, and because of what they're having to disclose given regulations. How is that affecting your world, Natalie?
Yeah, no, for sure. The point is that when I look at sustainability, it also needs to be sustainable in terms of profitability for a grower to stay in business. So for me, the incentive is to try to build truly sustainable solutions that are also affordable and that a person can use, and that come together. And they do truly result in higher yields, so that you can, if it is going to cost more, you have to offset it. because nobody can run a business, in the hole forever. The debt situation in farming it's not a laughing matter. I mean, it is a serious situation across the board, many parts of the world, the stress that farmers are under from that. And if this comes as an additional layer, what's the challenge? And I think California really highlights this a lot, is that things are a little bit out of sync. So the regulations potentially would drive people to bring solutions that would maybe fit or meet that. But if the regulations come first and then they drive that response, there's that lag time where you can't afford to work within the regulations. Sort of, it forces who can actually maintain, their farming operations, depending on how well they've been able to be financed or, manage their resources. It kind of narrows the field a bit. I think that's a potential risk as well. So yeah. Definitely. So sustainability for me is also including that it's a sustainable work environment and it's a sustainable place for people to be able to operate profitably. It's not just about carbon footprint or that sort of thing. It's a bit broader in my mind.
Yeah, it was funny. I was trying to think about when Rachel asked me about this talk and lowering the intensity, I didn't want it to just be lowering the chemical intensity, because that can sort of put people off, or lowering the emissions intensity. And then how do you bring in the social aspect? Like, what do you want to lower? Lowering the bad workplace intensity, what's this human element? But yes, that's so important to consider, because ultimately that's where a lot of these pressures are coming from as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit on drivers. So kind of, well, I guess the only other driver that was on my mind that we didn't talk about was like declining efficacy of some of these products. And I would be really curious your guys' view on this, herbicide resistance, pesticide resistance, the kind of tool set that's evolved out of the Green Revolution and the industrial era that's helped us to solve for productivity. Are we reaching the limitations of that? And is part of this a question of new tool sets that we need? Nancy, what are you seeing?
Do you want to start on that, Nancy?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the combination of the decline efficacy through resistance, the regulations of products and restrictions are all massive incentives for change. In many ways, like if I think about insecticides specifically, or pesticides in general, are very effective tools, but it's the way in which growers need to use them. They're used as more of a blunt instrument when, entire fields or farms are inoculated with that control measure. And particularly around insects, it's because it's such a guessing game. So growers can't take that risk. And, you have a product that's really quite effective, but as soon as you apply it in that way, it has a big chance of ending up where it shouldn't. And so the overuse, the off-farm issues, I think now with you see what's happening with the neonicotinoid groups and the bees. Those have been massive drivers for change, and I feel like you need that mix between the stick and the carrot, and getting those in line to be able to have innovation for new products. And there's some super exciting new biological products that are coming into the marketplace that I think are potentially game changers. And really then it comes to how do we help growers have that assurance around using these new products that traditionally, they haven't worked so well, or they don't have the confidence, or they're applied too late, or in the middle of the day when some of these new biological insecticide products are more sensitive to environmental conditions and change. So I think understanding where those barriers are will be key to really helping move the needle on moving away from that broad scale inoculation to that more targeted variable rate, to then that placing those biologicals, they work differently. So really helping growers adapt that and change is super exciting.
There was a New York Times article recently on herbicide resistance and how prevalent this is. And it sort of hit me like, oh, this, like my stepdad or something shared it with me who doesn't work in agriculture and was like, oh, do you know anything about this? And it was sort of like, oh, wow, this has kind of hit the mainstream. And yeah, for years now, there's been kind of environmental and activist conversations around everything from GMOs to glyphosate and things like that. But it was actually a pretty well-researched look into declining yields, or plateauing yields, I should say, and different weeds and how they're evolving, and the timelines of companies developing new products versus resistance developing. And this is a pretty existential challenge for some in the supply chain, but I guess to Nancy's point, also an opportunity to think about new products, more service offerings, different ways of working, different opportunities. I don't know, Natalie, how are you seeing the balance of like challenge versus opportunity?
Yeah, there's a ton of opportunity here, but the challenges are truly huge. And I think the thing to keep in mind, actually, I was with a farmer one day, and he said to me, I only have 30 times to get this right. And it was a really interesting perspective, because what has happened now is we actually have a generation of farmers who came up with the benefit of the ease of a tool like glyphosate and Roundup resistant. And honestly, farmers do have a number of challenges, and weeds are the #1 competitor with their crops. They're going after the same resources. So if you give them a tool that's going to simplify this for them, what happened was that people, and the price was good, and people took a choice to actually use that tool. It became very simple, and now this group of growers is sometimes referred to as the Roundup generation, that grew up with it. And so what we're starting to see happen now, as was inevitable to happen, that we had some escapes. These Palmer can make 1 million seeds a plant that are resistant. So trying to manage, that kind of a situation is really a big challenge. But then what the growers are doing now is they are actually bringing back a lot of old practices and a lot of chemistries, even from the 1980s, which have been existing. They're coming back into the toolbox now, more diversified solutions, different types of tillage practices, different types of crop rotations, smothering out the weeds. So it has caused people to move back into more diversified crop management systems. But as Nancy indicated, the other thing, as I've developed some biologicals over the years, it's been really remarkable to think about if you've come up, actually most of us in the industry have come up developing chemicals. I was trained at UC Davis. I learned all the ITM practices, but most of the sharp tools, like Nancy said, are traditional synthetic chemicals. When you build them, you build a certain way of profiling efficacy and things. When you're working with biologicals, they're quite different, because most of them, out of good sense and evolutionary principles, are not going to kill off more than half of their diet. So I kind of had that revelation at certain points when I was working with scientists on some of these solutions. And I said, we're assessing the performance. We're expecting 90 to 100% control from a biological thing that it's not in their best interest to kill all of its diet, right? So the fundamentals of how you develop are completely different. And trying to think about how you're going to balance out all these forces in the ecosystem and get everything right, like Nancy indicated, it's truly a lot more complicated when you're thinking about managing. And then you're also thinking about, am I going to get the right rain? What's my price going to be like? There's just a lot of pieces. And so I think there's opportunities for people to come around growers, though, and support them with all this complexity, because it is a bit more complex farming operation when you might apply like agroecology principles. I know it's a darn big job just to keep up with my little garden here, where I don't do a lot of it. I keep saying to my herbicide guy, can you give me a bioherbicide? We haven't really found a blockbuster yet. That's the thing. Like, something like a bioherbicide it's a unicorn if we can find something like this and bring it forward. So, yeah.
Nancy, I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of farmer reactions to this challenge. I know it depends on what farmer you ask and where in the world it exists. I saw on Twitter the other day a Palmer weed pulling competition, like who could pull this big super weed out the biggest. And I was like, this is hilarious, but also like, really? This is like where we're up to, is like it's become this like muscle weed pulling competition. Like, don't we see this as an existential threat? And at the same day, I talked to a retailer selling, inputs and chemicals in the same geography in the US. And it was like, no, like herbicide resistance isn't a problem. Like, I'm not seeing any indication of this from growers. Like, we're going to continue to sell these products for years and years. And I was like, oh, well, that's not what I'm seeing. But it really depends on where you're looking, and depends on, I think it goes to the saying, like, if your sort of job depends on you seeing something a certain way, and it's not a bad thing. Like, if you're out there selling chemicals and you're still selling them, then it's not that chemicals themselves are bad. It's the whole system we've come to depend on. But I don't know, Nancy, what are you hearing from farmers?
Yeah, I think there's, I can use fall armyworm as a great example. So it came across the top end of Australia in January 2020. So it's anytime you have a new pest to manage, there's a lot of learnings that growers are going through. And I think the exciting thing is there are some biologicals that are getting very good results, and they're making them a real option in their toolbox. And so this is Foligen, it's ag biotech that has this product. It's a virus against this pest. The challenging bits, is it has to be stored at 4 degrees C, and then it has to arrive at the property and kept under those conditions. So there's these challenges around everywhere from the supply chain of the product to the application in the field to the confidence and assurance that it's working. But there is wide recognition that it's effective if used well. It's a great additional tool in the toolbox. When you have those types of tools, it's meeting the IPM strategy of starting off soft, and then to be able to really come in with a chemistry in a more targeted way, synthetic chemistry in a more targeted way later. The other challenge, though, is just having enough supply available when you have a pest that's really very, fall armyworm is very good at what it does, and it's wreaking havoc. But I think the conversations have changed. The main thing is that growers are wanting to reduce their risk of cost and loss. So if there are products and means by which we can break down that barrier, and I think that's where ag tech really can come to play, then they're open. I've never met a farmer yet that says they want to spray more product, never, but it is a way to minimize risk, to reduce that loss and that cost. And the margins in ag are so small that, you're often talking about, when is the right time for them to take a risk and to learn how to do something differently? When can they afford that? So it's a social, I'd say maybe 20% of it's a technical problem, and the 80% is the social problem and helping support change, giving them that assurance. But the conversation, I think there's an appetite for the conversation. And I see that throughout other news channels and media in the discussions around biopesticides. And it seems to be driven by both sides with the consumers as well. But I also don't think consumers have a clue, most of them, about how food's grown and produced. So there is this sometimes this lack of connection about the realities of how challenging, just the sheer fact that an apple is on the tree for months and months, and 24/7, something else wants to eat it before you ever get the chance. And the challenge of that is extraordinary. Yeah. Just like Natalie's talking about her backyard garden, you can go out the next morning and there has something there that has been, eating exactly what you wanted to eat. And so it is challenging. Producing food can be very challenging.
Sarah, one thing I would say is that one thing about it is, well, except for the fact that it's being removed from the market in some places, but a solution like Roundup, it may not solve some of the big weeds that are resistant to it now, but it will actually solve most of the others. So one of the things that's a nuanced conversation is that just because there is resistance to one of the driver targets that you're going after doesn't mean the tool has completely lost its utility, as an example. It's just that we have to use it with a more holistic approach. It makes it a bit more complicated, and you sort of have to retool the way you approach it. At UPL, we're looking to reinvent, these older chemistries all the time to bring different value. And I did see a chat in there about robotic spot spraying and things, and there's huge potential around that. And there's also huge opportunities and things that will come with respect to being much more precise and much more specific. I talked with a grower down east. We call this portion in North Carolina down east in the Blacklands. And he was talking about what he really needs is the right product in the right place at the right time, the right amount of it. So the precision that's coming in agriculture to enable growers to do this, because exactly to Nancy's point, he's not going to spend a penny more than he has to grow that crop, and nobody wants him to. We don't want him to either, because I don't want to pay more for the food. So it's all about how can you put it together smartly, and how can we get more out of data integration and analytics and artificial intelligence and different things that can inform farming practices with better decisions. And even to that point around supply chain, it's a true challenge. Yeah, I launched a product once, and one of the countries we started in was Greece, because they actually had supply chain with refrigeration. And it can help you inform, where to go with it, because otherwise, really wasn't going to fly. And I felt like it was interesting, and that did give me quite a bit. He's a younger farmer, He's very focused on managing the land for the future, for himself. You know, he's young, and he wants to do things in a way that he can be proud and really pleased, you know, with what he's doing. So, but that was the point he basically said to us: right product, right place, right time, right rate. I want to have it all optimized.
Yeah,
So,
totally, 100%.
Yeah.
Nancy, you said something before I wanted to jump back to and unpack. You talked about, so we've kind of highlighted the challenges. You talked about a kind of phased transition was how I heard it, from like where we are now to where we might be in the future. Does it jump right to biologicals? How might we get from where we are now to lower intensity? And then maybe we can move away from chemicals and talk about other kinds of intensity, but maybe break down that transition a little.
Yeah, well, the farming system, the entire system is set up for using a precise tool, for example, herbicide or an insecticide, but delivered in quite a blunt way on a big tractor, sprayed to get fantastic coverage. And you've got growers have a lot of flexibility about when they apply that to still get a pretty good outcome. So it really has been a simple system. But then with the overuse and resistance and regulation, this is all changing. So it's the transition to the future of some of these exciting biologicals is not going to be a massive step change. It's going to be an integrated approach. It's going to be a lot of learnings and assurance with growers around that risk reduction. And I think probably the first step will be that move to more variable rate application of insecticide, the ability to identify when pests show up and then target, even with drone technology, if we can show where the pests are, when they arrive, approaching them early, you could imagine having drones immediately go in and just target key areas instead of inoculating the entire field. Having confidence around then, what does that mean for getting the level of control, being able to have feedback loops to growers that say that that's working. Those will all be really critical pieces of information and barriers we can break down to help that transition from broad scale inoculation to variable rate to now let's have biologicals first and foremost in the system, keeping the chemicals in the toolbox for the really challenging times, to then, a system where biologicals are the predominant control strategy. And, biologicals work so differently. They often have to be applied early to allow the population to build up. You have to have the pest, the host around to some extent. They often need to be applied in an area-wide fashion. You think about some of this new exciting mating disruption technology that's sprayable. Well, you can't just spray that on a single field because nothing stops a mated female from coming in from next door and laying her eggs and game over. So, it has to be applied with your neighbors in an area-wide approach. So I think those are the key components that will allow us to really start transitioning, that dependency on synthetic chemistry. We need to help reduce that. The tools in the toolbox for synthetics are also not as available. More targeted products are the way that we're going, but then to open up and unlock the biologicals as a real, what we start with in the season, not just as a niche or not just as organics, but we're going to need to be able to support that process and help growers have that assurance that how we do it and that they're working, but also the supply chain, so producers, suppliers of those products, like those challenges of the refrigeration, biologicals are more sensitive to shelf life, more sensitive to temperature and environmental. So the ability to know when a pest is showing up, to the supply chain to know how to get it there quickly, that right timing in the field, not putting it on in the middle of the day, all those things will have to be considered to get the end result, which is reduced costs and loss from insect pests that continue to, they're doing very well. They continue to challenge us and basically compete with us for food in a very significant way.
Oh, yeah.
Does that transition kind of pathway resonate with you, Natalie? Is that how you see things happening?
No, Nancy makes a really good point that with the more sophisticated approach, I guess I might say, to holistic crop management, we do have to take more of an ecosystem approach. It's even to the point that if you look at the pigweed situation in the US, there are people that are ascribing land values to whether or not there's a resident population of certain types of resistant weeds. It can affect the value of your land, and you can collect that information through a variety of different means. So people are incentivized to keep their fields clean, but if your neighbor, doesn't cooperate with you and allows, I see it driving around here. I'll see a clean field. I'll see one all covered in pigweeds, and I'm thinking, how are people managing the land? Because you keep that weed bank there. So with the transitory pests like insects, it's a different dilemma. You can sort of systematically go at something like a resistant population of weeds by chipping away at it. And I know in rice, in many places in rice country, red rice still will get rogued by hand. People will still go out there sometimes by horses to not allow such a noxious weed as that to get established in their crops. But yeah, the point that it requires an ecosystem approach. The other thing I think that's been really challenging for a lot of biologicals to launch is that it also, not just from the perspective of farmers learning new tools that they were not raised, with growing practices with, because of the fact that we've come kind of through this chemical revolution, also have a situation where the people in the industry that are supporting them also do require quite a bit of training. Because for many of us, we've been selling against biologicals too, when they come along. So if you try to bring a biological solutions into a chemical company, also there is a challenge of helping people to have confidence and to be comfortable with, in some ways, like putting their reputation on the line. You're recommending a solution to a farmer. You got to have confidence that it's going to work. And if it doesn't work the first time, again, it's like this, I only got 30 times to get this right. Like for a guy to take a gamble on something, that's also why you see a lot of growers will start with 1 or 10 acres, a small portion of their farm. They'll try something out. They'll grow and they'll get more confident and they'll adopt it over time. But there is quite a bit of complexity, but there's a lot of great opportunities and there's a lot of great resources like the Extension Service, at least in the US. I don't know quite as much about the systems in Australia, but to train and support people and to learn those practices. I did extension work in the past, and it brought me great joy to really work with farmers and help to understand their problems. Think about like, what was the way that I could really generate convincing data or work with growers who could share their experience with others to think about adopting, different types of practices. But it is a behavioral change, and these are difficult. Also it's just challenging for humans to change patterns. So there's an element of that as well.
That's like the world you live in every day, Nancy, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah. You, as we were kind of talking about solutions, and autonomy came up before, that's one of the areas where we're excited about a step change and even new possible business models that arise when you've got a robot going out and can go slow and not compact the soil because it's smaller and spot spray or mechanically chip at a weed, or it's got a microwave technology and so it can zap the weed seed bank pre-emergence. Like it sort of unlocks whole new ways of thinking about management of these kinds of pests. And so that's sort of one category of solution that we're really excited about. Ageris was mentioned in the chat, swarm farm robotics we've invested in. So there's a number of solutions there. A whole nother example is, as I think about the challenge for the input companies who are, or retailers in particular, who are selling existing products, this conversation can be pretty scary. Like, are we going to not sell the product that is our core business line right now? We're seeing some solutions that are part of managing risk and enabling new inputs that have an element of their business model that will need to be sold to farmers and have extension. And so whether that's supported with a service and you have more service revenue, or it's got a consumable aspect because of part of the technology, and so you're selling that over time. I don't think the channel's going away. I think there's just new possible business models or functions there. I don't know, how does that resonate with you guys?
Do you want to go, Natalie?
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. Oh, well, no, I for sure, the use of robotics, when it's used smartly with spot spray, will reduce the application of herbicides. It's a high probability. The question is going to be the rate at which it occurs and whether or not we have smart enough integrated analytics to understand and to be able to track, for instance, weed populations. So I will admit that maybe 7 years ago, folks were really talking about that with me, and I really thought there's no way that we're going to go away from broadcast, like pre-emergence herbicide applications in the US in row crops. This will not happen. It's too risky for people to do this. But with some of the technology that's coming, if the pricing is right and people can we can use imagery analytics to direct these robotics or drone applications to go out into the field, I think people would go for that. There's no reason why they wouldn't, as long as it's all about the price per acre and what you're going to be gaining off of that. So it depends on how you get to the solution. Because when you're driving a giant tractor across the field, it's also really expensive. I met with the farmer one time too. It was really interesting, and he was talking about building up his farm with robotics tractors. They're cheaper actually for him. And he had a metric that went into how much land he would bring online into his farming operation based on whether or not he would have to buy another tractor. And because the price was lower, he could actually bring in more land at a higher rate because it didn't have as much overall cost, because he was just thinking about the time, running the operation, having people on him versus autonomous. But I can go on and on that topic. It's one of my favorite topics. So I want to hear what Nancy has to say.
Yeah, those are great points and great example. I want to touch on so I have nothing of greater value to add on that point about the robotics. I think it's well said, Natalie. I want to pick up on the point that Sarah was saying about the distribution channels, not going away. And this was really interesting for us. We launched our company 3 years ago. So we were former scientists at the CSRO, and we've always been working on sustainable pest management. And I have to admit, when we first launched with the whole technology space and hardware-enabled software, we were thinking of ourselves a little bit as, well, not a little bit, a lot, as a disruptor of the traditional, ag space. But the reality is the best way and path to get change is through these traditional distribution channels, through your boots on the ground, ag resellers, through the crop protection companies who have the distribution channels, the years of experience, and solutions that have allowed us to have cheap available food. So that was quite a big, when you're a researcher and you're always playing in the future and you think you're smart and you're clever and this is the way to go. And the bottom line is just not. Like, working with the people who have been there through and through and have the customers, which are the growers, that are needing to reduce risk. I think it's a really eye-opening and exciting way to deliver new technology is through those types of partnerships. And because everybody knows we want to change, but nobody wants their revenue threatened. So you have to think about your ag chemical store in your small rural communities. They play such an important role for that community. They're the touch points, they're the conversations that growers have. They're often the only people that a grower sees outside his family when they're doing this traveling. So they're there for more reasons than just selling product. Of course, they need to sell product, but they have to provide a service that's going to get the outcome that growers need. And that's that reduced risk and of cost and loss. So so I don't think the distribution channels are going away. I think there's huge opportunities for ag tech to help those channels have better conversations, better information and analytics, to do some of the exciting things about breaking down the barriers that, some of those barriers that do mean we can't move forward with more precision pest management and precision agriculture in general. So I guess that's just maybe a personal insight to say of a maturity on our part about the space of agriculture and the traditional nature of it, but at the same time, the exciting innovation opportunities, that we can deliver.
We see this all the time, like companies we look at who come into agriculture from the outside, which is absolutely needed. That's where I've come into this space from. I didn't grow up on a farm, that have a view of like, exactly this, we're going to disrupt something, and why don't we just do it this completely new way, and maybe haven't spent the time to figure out why the system is the way it is and why it works how it works. And we've seen a lot of those companies burn a lot of cash and not get very far because they kind of haven't fundamentally understood how the channel works, or that, to Yoshi's point in the chat, growers are really good business people and do make sound economic decisions and are trying to manage risk and costs. And so thinking about the existing incentives and the existing systems, it's something at least we spend a lot of time figuring out whether companies we're considering investing in have spent the time to understand and think about. And that goes to all different kinds of business models, selling to farmers and otherwise in ag.
Yep.
And I think it comes back a lot to humility. Growers I know, for the most part, are some of the most humble people in the world because they live at the whims of nature. Their livelihood
Like
is at
I
the
couldn't
whim of
do it.
nature. So any notion of ego, and I think that companies that would also choose to take this humble, we're learning together approach. I also believe in a way that this could be the pivot point with biologicals, where you don't go out and oversell something. Don't oversell the solution. Don't say that it's an end all be all fix all. If we could stop doing that with biologicals, it would benefit the industry overall. This is one tool that's going to complement other tools. We're going to work together and figure it out. And then it's an experiment. I mean, farmers are experimenting on their farms all the time anyways. So, let's get together and let's learn about it, and let's not pretend that we have it all figured out, because we don't. I mean, we really don't for most of these solutions. And we don't know when we bring it into a new environment what exactly is going to happen. You can do all the predictive modeling in the world, and then there's going to be nature doing what it does. So I think that there's also some great opportunities personally from that perspective to go out and learn from folks.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's why we started our podcast, because I just knew that I wanted to hear more from farmers living these challenges, and I felt shy to ask them to talk to me. And so I was like, come on this podcast that I have, and then tell me your story. And I have just heard fantastic stories of how the industry works. And I mean, some of those farmers I've then ended up on their farm halfway across the world because of meeting, through the podcast. So it becomes an industry that can seem insular, seem hard to break into, but is actually really open, I've found, and willing to have these conversations and meet new people and embrace different perspectives. Even though, especially around some of the sustainability stuff, it's pretty challenging. I wanted to talk briefly, because we spent a lot of time on herbicides and pesticides, about other kinds of intensity. So emissions is one, whether it's kind of green logistics or transport, electrification, carbon in the supply chain. What, Natalie, from where you sit, when you think about kind of intensity and other forms of it, what's been on your mind or of interest to you?
Lately, I've been learning a lot about carbon sequestration in that whole market as it's emerging. So that's been a new area for me to learn about. But this focus on hyper-local, I think, is really interesting. And then also to the element even of indoor farming. And this is a really amazing thing that's evolving, but I do have a lot of questions about that, to be honest, in terms of what's the actual footprint of this system, like holistically. And I haven't done the research to see any reports or anything if anybody's really calculated this, but it's a really cool gee whiz, and it is amazing actually what people are doing. Even locally here, I was on a panel with Aero Farms recently, and one of the scientists from there was speaking, and she showed me the picture of their site in New Jersey, and it's remarkable. These indoor bays with all of this lettuce, but we were discussing about, powering it. And you can't put up enough solar panels, on the top of these buildings to support the power that's needed to do it. And so it's a different way to approach intense agriculture. But on the other hand, you have the benefit of not having to ship. I wouldn't have to get lettuce from California, shipped all the way to me. So I don't understand, to be honest, how it all balances out. But I'm pretty curious about that. And then how this carbon market's going to evolve and how carbon credits are going to balance out. It's a really fascinating topic, and I'm glad to know a lot of smart people that are really working on it to try to figure this out. But it's because how things balance out when you're looking at the scale of the earth, how are we balancing out all these input outputs and that topic.
100%. Yeah.
That's one thing I'm thinking a lot about is this indoor farming thing.
Yeah, just on carbon briefly, one thing that's been exciting here in the US is how much people are turning to Australia to sort of see into the future a little bit. I think that's because of climate challenges we have, but also the carbon market in Australia, the fact that credits were sold recently, farmers at Wilmot and Cavan Station selling credits to Microsoft for the practices that they were employing on farm and the data they had. So Australia is kind of this leader in that space, and some tech companies involved in that, which has been really exciting to see that that's globally recognized, not just something we're drinking our own Kool-Aid about, which is great. But yeah, to the point about local, I've seen studies that show surprisingly that the cost of production, so you sort of got the production intensity and then you've got the transport, and people focus on the transport piece, but so much more of the emissions is in the production and in the economies of scale. So something like a ship full of millions of apples coming from New Zealand versus a rickety pickup truck coming from 100 miles away, you can actually have a lower transport emissions intensity from further away because of the method of transport and the scale of it. And then you get into production intensity as well. And then you get into how is all this measured, and do we have a kind of standardized, framework for counting these emissions? So I think the challenge is it's not it's not easy, and sometimes it's not obvious what is local actually better. And with those indoor systems, how efficient are we at converting solar into food, and like the cost of that energy and the emissions profile of it versus the transport cost, it might actually not be better.
And there is no chemical input though in those systems in terms of pesticides being applied. Generally they're done that way. There's fertilizers and things I believe used. I started to learn a little bit about it, but in terms of a disruption as well. So it's kind of an interesting point, because then you have theoretically acres of lettuce where you would have no inputs being sold to them from the traditional input market. So, but even in Salinas around there, a lot of that's being done with robots as well. So some of that disruption's already started to happen, but yeah.
Exciting. I know there's a few questions from the audience here. So there's one here from Kai around, is there acceptance within the population for the major changes that are about to come in agriculture due to some of these necessities we've been talking about? We've talked a little bit about it, acceptance on the farming side. I guess more broadly, sort of social license and the conversation with consumers and investors. What are you guys hearing? Nancy, what have you been hearing?
Yeah, farmers we talk about them as a category, but of course they are a broad representation of the public in many ways in terms of their interest and willingness to change and adopt. And these conversations we've been talking about more sustainable practices for quite some time. I'm always interested in what are the factors that have to align that make us either have a step change or nudge just a little bit more. So the conversations, there's interest. There's also some, farmers feel overwhelmed by the number of apps. You hear that as well. I think it's a changing landscape. There's huge opportunity. There's an appetite, but it has to be grounded in some of the realities of what it means to produce food. So, I'll bring in the scientist perspective a bit. When you're a scientist, you're expected to come up with solutions. So the biggest problem of scientists is that you stay in the lab and you create something that's great. You don't get out of the building and actually find out what's the real pain point for what you're trying to solve for. And I think that was one of our biggest early learnings when we developed our technology. Was the best thing we did was to get out of the building and go have conversations with the people who have the pain, that are really interested in solutions, not just adopting a new technology for the sake of adopting it, but something that's going to increase efficiencies, reduce their risk and cost, give them better margins. They're interested. So the appetite is there if it's meaningful for their business, and they're business people. So yeah, I don't really have anything more substantial than that position of, if you're a tech developer, the best thing you can be doing is getting out of the building. And a lot of technology people are smart. They can put things together. They can have great solutions. It's just whether or not it's meaningful to the end user, and that's where we really need to be spending our time.
I know one thing I saw in raising our fund was like where we talk about impact, we talk about quantifying impact and shifting agriculture to a carbon neutral or better and climate resilient or better system. And we definitely got more questions from investors about, are you serious about impact? How are you really thinking about it? Than we did like, oh, is this philanthropy and not commercial? Are you a concessionary fund? And I was pretty surprised by that. I thought we would get a lot more like, oh, is this too hippy dippy? Do you, you're really going to make any good investments here, versus, do you really mean it when you say impact? Which I thought was great and really exciting, and definitely the conversations I've had in the past few months here in Silicon Valley and in the US have been a real shift towards impact. And yet two challenges: one, like, are there any companies that can really deliver on it? And two, how the heck do we measure it? Because our investors in the institutional world wants us to make these claims, but what do we actually measure? And how do we prove that it's true? So that's a little bit of what I'm seeing.
And Sarah, do you feel like the way in which we're measuring it is going to be simple enough that adoption can happen? Because sometimes we go down this path, like ecosystem services, all of a sudden it got so complicated. It was almost like an accounting spreadsheet that it became exhausting and not practical.
That's what I wonder.
And so somehow if we're going to measure, it has to be meaningful and practical, and not stay as an academic exercise, but that it's measurable, it's, it's simple, it's repeatable, it has a meaning in the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, that's
like
actually,
conversations are cyclical because of
totally. I mean, that's been the conversation. Like when I was in grad school and was one of the few people looking at food and ag and going into the space, and a lot of the other people in the kind of impact or sustainability circles I would be in were looking at energy. And it was so easy for them because it was just like CO2 offset, right? Like it was just really easy to measure. And I was like, oh, well, the food miles, but then the production intensity, but what about the chemicals and then nutrition and food and human health? And everyone's like, too hard, run away. And so I do think that is a challenge. We've got natural systems, we've got complexity. And yet where I gain hope is and not to be fully a techno optimist, but the technology is advancing such that some of the constraints right now around how do we enter all this data, and it takes time, and I've got to go measure all these things, like satellites will just sense it, models will just estimate it, and we don't have to be so accurate to the point of we actually know every single piece. We can manage it at landscape scale, at portfolio scale, and that's where I'm starting to gain a bit of hope.
That's super exciting, because we used to say the same thing about, you want to use something that's universal measurement. Like think of car emissions. You pull up to the place to get your emissions checked. They put a thing on the end of your muffler. They test your emissions. You get a score and it's done. All of a sudden with agriculture, you've got the fragmentation, the seasonality, the supply chain, and then everybody, so I love the fact that you can see line of sight of some of these exciting technologies that can start to give us benchmarking, reasonable estimates that allow us to take action. I mean, that's super exciting.
Definitely.
I think that what Kai might be getting at is around acceptance from consumers, or consumer actions really driving these things through political activities and things. I mean, I would say we certainly can see this happening in Europe. And Europe influences California, Brazil, major markets around the world, eventually the EPA. So seeing these patterns, and we are losing chemical registrations in Europe at such a rate that people are left with no solutions for some pests, which either can help you say, well, maybe we should get the registration back, because we didn't bring an alternative quick enough. And so there are some places where some crops can no longer be grown. This is kind of a reality that's emerging right now. Maybe they got to be grown there because of the fact that there were other tools around, that allowed crops to expand. So it's complicated, right? But the point is that that is driving an urgency and a need, and businesses, of course, want to make profits as well. So if the market for your product goes away, you start to diversify your investments and bring different things like biologicals into the market that we would hope would have an easier registration pathway. But it's also really complicated right now because the regulations are being shaped. So the reality is, when you're trying to develop things like biologicals in a company for a global portfolio, and you don't know what the regulations are going to be required, it also makes it really difficult. To be honest, it's really tricky. Like, so we're going to do this. What studies are we going to have to do? And it's not actually known right now because they're being established around the world. But yeah, I think the point is that it's just the consumer demand, and I would say that companies, like you're saying, Sarah, investors wanting to be able to make these investments into companies that have a provable sustainability profile, I think that it is driving a lot of this investment and this shift. Besides the fact that, the fires in California, no water, all these different things happening that as humans we're experiencing, and maybe because we did have this pause we're more aware of it because we haven't been rushing around as much in planes, which is maybe benefiting things like carbon, but
definitely. Yeah, I think our footprint has gone down during COVID, despite all the consumables and trash and things we're creating. But that does kind of bring us full circle. And we might leave it there so people have a chance to chat in smaller groups, kind of covering drivers for lower intensity, enablers of what that might look like, and some of the challenges on the way. So yeah, thanks, Natalie and Nancy. That's been really fun to cover. And I've got lots of good notes of things. I definitely learned some things. So hopefully listeners did too.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, Nancy, Natalie. That was wonderful and so much food for thought.